March 24, 1945. 19,000 feet above the rolling forests of Thuringia, where early spring mist clung to valleys and the cold air at altitude turned breath to ice crystals on oxygen masks. First Lieutenant William Mackenzie, United States Army Air Forces, felt his P-51 Mustang shudder as 20mm cannon rounds from a diving Focke-Wulf 190 tore through the right-wing root. The aircraft yawed violently to the right, the control stick suddenly loose in his hand as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy in a fine mist that froze instantly in the sub-zero temperature. The engine coughed once, twice, then seized completely, a catastrophic failure that transformed 1,900 horsepower of American engineering into dead weight. Mackenzie had perhaps 30 seconds before the Mustang became uncontrollable, perhaps a minute before it entered a spin from which no recovery would be possible. Below him, through breaks in the clouds, the German countryside stretched in patches of forest and farmland, and among those patches, perhaps 3 miles distant, the straight lines of a small airfield, runways, hangars, the geometric precision that marked human organization of landscape for military purpose. Standard procedure dictated bailout. The P-51 was finished, its engine destroyed, its control surfaces compromised, its fate sealed by those few seconds of accurate German gunnery. But Mackenzie, calculating with the cold precision that 127 combat missions had trained into instinct, recognized that the Mustang still had glide ratio, still had enough control authority for one final maneuver, still possessed the forward momentum that could be traded for distance if managed correctly. The airfield below was German, hostile, a place where landing meant immediate capture and imprisonment for the remainder of the war. But it was also an airfield, which meant aircraft, which meant the possibility, remote, dangerous, perhaps suicidal, of not ending this mission as a prisoner, but as a pilot who had simply changed aircraft mid-flight through unconventional means. He did not bail out. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed, configuring the dying Mustang for what would be either an emergency landing or a controlled crash, depending on how the next 2 minutes unfolded. The airfield grew larger in his windscreen, details resolving from geometric abstraction into concrete reality. A single runway perhaps 4,000 feet long, a control tower, 3 hangars, and dispersed around the perimeter, perhaps a dozen aircraft in various states of readiness. Mackenzie had no radio communication, no way to coordinate with anyone, no plan beyond the immediate necessity of getting the Mustang on the ground, while it still responded to control inputs. At 500 feet, he dropped the landing gear manually, felt the drag increase, adjusted his glide path with the last remaining hydraulic pressure. At 200 feet, he could see German personnel on the ground, see them pointing, see them beginning to move toward where he would land. At 50 feet, the Mustang crossed the runway threshold, flared, touched down hard but intact, and rolled perhaps 1,500 feet before Mackenzie stood on the brakes and brought it to a stop. For 5 seconds, silence. The engine was dead. The propeller had stopped windmilling. Through the canopy, Mackenzie could see Germans running toward him from multiple directions. Ground crew, soldiers, officers. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached him, perhaps 45 if they approached cautiously, concerned about potential weapons or booby traps. And in those seconds, Mackenzie made a calculation that combined desperation, tactical opportunity, and the kind of audacity that characterized American fighter pilots who had been taught to think independently, to improvise, to exploit any advantage regardless of how unconventional the method. Parked perhaps 100 yards from where the Mustang had stopped, clearly visible across the tarmac, sat a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter forces, an aircraft Mackenzie had fought against dozens of times, had studied in intelligence briefings, had seen in photographs and captured examples. It was alone, separated from other aircraft, positioned as though ready for immediate flight, with no visible personnel working on it. The canopy was closed, the propeller was in course pitch position. Every detail suggested an aircraft that had been prepared for a mission but not yet crewed, sitting in that brief window between pre-flight and pilot assignment. By March 1945, the air war over Germany had entered its final, desperate phase. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength through attrition, fuel shortages, and the systematic destruction of its training infrastructure. German pilots still fought with courage and skill, but they fought defensively now, outnumbered, operating from bases that moved frequently to avoid Allied bombing, flying aircraft that were often patched together from salvaged parts. The small airfield where Mackenzie had landed represented this fragmentation, a secondary facility, lightly defended, with minimal personnel, surviving through obscurity rather than strength. The Germans running toward his crashed Mustang expected a prisoner, perhaps wounded, certainly defeated, ready to be processed through the machinery of captivity that had been refined over 5 years of war. What they did not expect, what no tactical manual prepared them for, was an American pilot who interpreted an emergency landing not as the end of his mission, but as an opportunity to acquire new equipment through immediate and unconventional means. Mackenzie popped the canopy, climbed out of the Mustang, dropped to the tarmac, and ran. Not away from the Germans, not toward cover, but directly toward the Bf-109 sitting alone on the apron. He covered the 100 yards in perhaps 15 seconds, his flight boots pounding concrete, his breath coming hard in the cold air. Behind him, German voices shouted, commands, questions, the universal tone of authority demanding that someone stop running and comply with orders. But the shouts were still distant, the Germans still processing what they were seeing, still caught in that moment of cognitive dissonance when reality violates expectations so thoroughly that response is delayed by incomprehension. Mackenzie reached the Bf-109, grabbed the wing root handhold, pulled himself up onto the wing, and wrenched the canopy open. The cockpit was familiar in its fundamental layout. All fighter aircraft shared certain commonalities, regardless of nationality, but different in 100 small details. German instrument labels, different throttle configuration, the distinctive Daimler-Benz engine controls that operated differently from the Packard Merlin he was accustomed to. But Mackenzie had studied captured German fighters during intelligence briefings, had memorized control positions, had absorbed the kind of information that seemed academic at the time, but now represented the difference between captivity and escape. He dropped into the seat, scanned the instruments with the rapid, systematic observation of a pilot who understood that time was measured in seconds, not minutes. Fuel, sufficient for perhaps 90 minutes of flight. Ammunition, loaded, though he had no intention of fighting if it could be avoided. Battery, charged. Magnetos, off. Throttle, idle position. The Bf-109 was ready to fly, requiring only the sequence of actions that would transform it from dormant machine to operational weapon. The symbolic object that defined this moment was neither weapon nor instrument, but something more fundamental, the ignition key. In American fighters, ignition was managed through switches and buttons, electrical systems that could be activated through memorized sequences. In German fighters, particularly the Bf-109, ignition required a physical key, a simple metal object that the pilot inserted, turned, and used to complete the electrical circuit that would start the engine. The key was missing from the ignition, taken by the German pilot or ground crew as a security measure to prevent unauthorized use. Without it, the Bf-109 was merely an expensive sculpture. But American pilots had been briefed on this vulnerability, had been taught that German fighters could be started without keys, if one understood the electrical system well enough to bypass the ignition lock. Mackenzie pulled the instrument panel access cover, exposing the wiring behind the gauges, and began what amounted to hot wiring an enemy fighter while German soldiers ran across the tarmac toward him. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had grown up on an Iowa farm repairing machinery, who understood that all engines operated on fundamentally similar principles, that wiring was wiring regardless of the language printed on the insulation. 30 seconds of work. Connecting two wires, bridging the gap where the key should have completed the circuit. Magnetos to on position. Fuel mixture to rich. Primer pump. 5 strokes. The manual fuel injection that German engines required for cold starts. Throttle advanced slightly from idle. And then the starter button, pressed firmly, held for 3 seconds as the Daimler-Benz engine turned over once, twice, coughed, caught, and roared to life with a sound distinctly different from the Merlin engines Mackenzie knew intimately. Deeper, rougher, the mechanical voice of German engineering. The German soldiers were 50 yards away now, close enough that Mackenzie could see their faces, see the mixture of shock and anger and professional urgency that characterized men who had just witnessed something that should not have been possible. Several had unslung their rifles. One, an officer by his bearing, was shouting and pointing. But they were still too far to physically stop him, still dealing with the reality that the American pilot they thought they had captured was now sitting in one of their fighters with the engine running. Mackenzie advanced the throttle, felt the Bf-109 begin to move. The aircraft was tail-heavy, the narrow landing gear making it want to ground loop if mishandled. But the basic principles of taxiing were universal. Use rudder to steer, keep the tail down, maintain directional control through throttle and brake inputs. He turned the aircraft away from the approaching soldiers, aligned it with the runway, ran through the abbreviated pre-takeoff checks that combat pilots learn to execute in seconds rather than minutes. Engine temperature, rising but acceptable. Oil pressure, good. Fuel, sufficient. Controls, responsive. The runway stretched ahead, 4,000 feet of concrete that represented the boundary between German captivity and Allied freedom, between failure and the most audacious escape of his combat career. Mackenzie released the brakes, advanced the throttle to take off power, and felt the Bf-109 accelerate with the urgent surge that characterized high-performance fighters regardless of their nationality. The tail came up at 40 miles per hour. The aircraft wanted to swing left, torque effect from the propeller, requiring right rudder to maintain runway alignment. At 90 miles per hour, Mackenzie pulled back gently on the stick, and the Bf-109 lifted cleanly into German skies, climbing away from the airfield where his Mustang sat disabled, and the German soldiers stood watching in what could only be described as professional disbelief. Behind him, the airfield receded. Below him, the forests of Thuringia spread toward horizons that marked the boundary between German and Allied-controlled territory. Ahead, perhaps 150 miles, lay the front lines, the fluid border where two massive armies ground against each other in the final battles of the European War. And above him, scattered across thousands of cubic miles of airspace, flew hundreds of Allied and German aircraft, any of which might mistake his Bf-109 for an enemy and attack without warning. The German pilots who flew the Bf-109 expected it to be flown by countrymen, to be identified through its distinctive profile as friendly rather than hostile, to operate within the tactical frameworks that Luftwaffe doctrine prescribed. What they did not anticipate, what no intelligence briefing had prepared them for, was an American pilot flying one of their fighters, using German markings and German aircraft characteristics to navigate through German airspace, exploiting the assumptions built into visual identification systems that had worked effectively until someone decided to violate every rule by which aerial warfare was conducted. Mackenzie flew west, maintaining 8,000 feet, a compromise altitude that kept him below the contrail-forming levels, where he would be easily visible but above the light flak that protected ground installations. He monitored the fuel gauge obsessively, calculating range against distance, knowing that the Bf-109 consumed fuel faster than his Mustang, that every mile west was a mile he might not have fuel to return from if he miscalculated. The German radio frequencies in his headset carried traffic, position reports, intercept coordinates, the routine communication of an Air Force still functioning despite overwhelming odds. None of it referenced a stolen fighter or an American pilot flying a Bf-109, suggesting that the airfield where he had landed either lacked radio communication or had not yet processed what had occurred sufficiently to broadcast warnings. At 30 minutes into the flight, Mackenzie crossed what he calculated was the approximate position of the front lines, marked on the ground by the devastation of sustained combat. Burned villages, cratered roads, the brown scars of artillery impacts cutting through the green landscape of early spring. He was over Allied territory now, flying an aircraft marked with German crosses and swastikas, subject to attack by his own forces if anyone spotted him and decided to engage before identifying. The irony was not lost on him. Having escaped German captivity by stealing a German fighter, he now faced the possibility of being shot down by Americans, who would be entirely justified in attacking what appeared to be an enemy aircraft. He descended to 2,000 feet, opened the canopy, and began flying in a manner no German pilot would use: wide, gentle turns, slow airspeed, the flight characteristics of an aircraft deliberately trying to be seen and identified rather than maintaining tactical advantage. And then, when he spotted a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts perhaps a mile distant, he did something that would have been suicidal in combat but was now necessary for survival. He rocked his wings in the international signal for friendly identification, then deployed his landing gear, a clear indication of non-hostile intent, a surrender of speed and maneuverability that no enemy fighter would voluntarily accept. The Thunderbolts approached cautiously, forming on his wings, close enough that he could see the American pilots looking at him with expressions that suggested they were as confused as the Germans had been 40 minutes earlier. Mackenzie pointed west, gestured at his fuel gauge in the universal language of pilots indicating fuel emergency, and maintained his heading toward the nearest Allied airfield. His map showed approximately 20 miles ahead. The landing at the American base, a temporary field carved from farmland, marked by pierced steel planking rather than concrete, was witnessed by perhaps 200 personnel, who had been summoned by radio warning that a German fighter was approaching with American escort claiming to be piloted by a friendly. Mackenzie touched down gently, rolled out, taxied to the indicated parking area, and shut down the engine. When he climbed out of the cockpit, still wearing his American flight suit under the German fighter's canopy, the silence was profound. The silence of people witnessing something that violated every operational expectation they possessed. The intelligence debriefing lasted 4 hours. Mackenzie described the engagement that had destroyed his Mustang, the emergency landing at the German airfield, the decision to steal the Bf-109, the flight back to Allied territory. Intelligence officers documented every detail, recognizing that he had not only escaped captivity but had brought back an intact German fighter that could be studied, that his route over German territory had provided reconnaissance of military value, that his action represented a case study in tactical improvisation under extreme circumstances. The transformation his escape represented was both tactical and philosophical. Tactically, it demonstrated that German airfields, even in March 1945, were vulnerable to individual actions that doctrine did not anticipate, that security procedures designed to prevent mass attacks could be defeated by single actors willing to take risks that seemed suicidal. Philosophically, it exemplified the American approach to warfare, individual initiative, willingness to improvise, refusal to accept defeat as final until all options had been exhausted. Mackenzie had not followed any manual, had not executed a planned operation, had simply recognized an opportunity and exploited it through combination of training, skill, and the kind of audacity that American military culture encouraged. The ignition key that had been missing from the Bf-109, that simple mechanical object whose absence should have prevented unauthorized use, represented the fundamental difference between American and German military philosophies. The Germans had designed their security around the assumption that, without the key, the aircraft was secure, a centralized control mechanism that worked perfectly until someone with sufficient technical knowledge circumvented it. The Americans, by contrast, had trained their pilots to understand systems deeply enough that mechanical locks became suggestions rather than absolute barriers, had encouraged the kind of independent thinking that could transform obstacles into solvable problems. The German fighter that should have been security keyed and unavailable instead became the tool of American escape, because one pilot understood that keys were merely convenient ways to complete electrical circuits, that circuits could be completed by other means if necessity demanded, that the rules governing mechanical systems could be exploited by those who understood the principles underneath the procedures. The key's absence had been designed to prevent exactly what Mackenzie accomplished, yet its absence was defeated by knowledge, by training that emphasized understanding over rote procedure, by a culture that valued problem-solving over rigid adherence to protocol. Mackenzie flew 23 more combat missions before the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He never flew another German aircraft. The stolen Bf-109 was turned over to intelligence for analysis, then eventually sent to the United States where it would be studied by engineers and displayed in museums as a curiosity. An enemy fighter captured not through combat but through theft, brought back by a pilot who had been shot down, had landed in enemy territory, and had simply decided that landing was an opportunity rather than a defeat. In the decades following the war, the story of Mackenzie's escape became a legend among fighter pilots, told and retold with variations and embellishments, but always centered on the core truth. An American pilot, shot down over Germany, had stolen an enemy fighter and flown it home. The story exemplified everything that American military culture claimed to value: initiative, resourcefulness, refusal to accept defeat, willingness to take risks that doctrine did not explicitly authorize but that tactical reality demanded. The deeper significance of his escape lay not in its tactical impact, one fighter stolen from an enemy who had already lost the war, but in what it revealed about the advantage democratic systems possessed over authoritarian ones. Mackenzie's action was only possible because he had been trained to think independently, to understand systems well enough to circumvent their security mechanisms, to recognize that rules existed to serve purposes rather than as ends in themselves. An authoritarian military culture that demanded strict adherence to procedure, that punished deviation from doctrine, that valued obedience over initiative, would never have produced a pilot capable of what Mackenzie accomplished. The missing ignition key that should have prevented the Bf-109's theft instead became the symbol of the war's larger truth: that mechanical locks and procedural barriers were insufficient against enemies who understood principles deeply enough to circumvent mechanisms, that centralized control systems contained vulnerabilities that decentralized systems did not, that the side willing to trust individual judgment would consistently outperform the side that demanded rigid adherence to authority. In the end, Mackenzie's theft of a German fighter and flight to Allied territory was not strategically decisive. The war would have ended on schedule regardless of whether he escaped or spent its final weeks in a POW camp. But his action demonstrated something more important than tactical victory. It demonstrated that wars are won, not just by those with superior numbers or technology, but by those who create systems that allow individuals to think creatively under pressure, to improvise solutions to problems that doctrine never anticipated, to transform defeat into opportunity through nothing more than skill, knowledge, and the kind of audacious initiative that free societies cultivate while authoritarian systems suppress. The Bf-109 that carried him to safety was German-built, but the ingenuity that started its engine without a key, that flew it through hostile airspace to friendly territory, that converted capture into escape, that was purely American, the product of a military culture that valued the individual warrior's judgment as highly as any commander's orders. That understood victory came not from perfect obedience, but from intelligent adaptation to circumstances that no plan could predict and no doctrine could control.